Hey everybody, my name is Jason and I am a pastor at Home Church in Nashville, and this is my friend.
Yeah, this is my friend. My name is David and I'm the pastor of Woodbury United Methodist Church in Woodbury.
Yeah, so we are here. We're going to be talking over the next few weeks, this journey through Lent to Easter, about the I am statements of Jesus. They're statements throughout the book of John where Jesus says, I am this and I am that. And we, as followers of Jesus, and we want to know who Jesus says he is and what he's about, because we want to be about what Jesus is about. And he has had impact on our lives, and we want to invite you into that. So we're just going to be talking about one statement each week. If you're at Home Church, we are also talking about these on Sundays. So this is kind of going a little deeper and more conversation, dialogue more than monologue. And
that's kind of with us with Woodbury. We're in actually in the Gospel of Mark right now, so not John where these statements are made, but there's a lot of kind of interaction and overlap. And so as we're looking in Jesus, the story of Jesus' life as it's told in the Gospel of Mark, it's great seeing how like this kind of connects over. So especially this coming week, we'll be looking at right around the same point in Jesus' life as we are in this conversation now.
Yeah, that's perfect. So the first week is Jesus talking about being the bread of life. And so we're going to go a little deeper, and Dave, start us off.
Well, let's read, and today we're in John chapter 6, and just going to read one verse here today, but then we'll be talking around kind of the whole chapter surrounding it. But this is verse 35. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty.
Yeah, one of the things that we see throughout the book of John and other places in scripture as well is so many times Jesus will make a spiritual statement and connect it with something that he's actually doing. So there'll be a story, and then there'll be commentary, or in this case, conversation around what he's talking about. So right before he says these words, Jesus has just fed over 5,000 people. And some of you may have heard that story before, that Jesus is teaching. He's kind of developed a reputation at this point. He's done some miracles, water in the wine and things like that. And so people are talking about him and then showing up to hear what he has to say. And so here, thousands of people have showed up to hear what he has to say. And Jesus sees that, and even before he starts talking, they're walking up. It says, with a great crowd coming to them, he looks at Philip and says, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? So I don't know if Jesus is planning on talking for a long time, and it's like, if we're gonna do this, like, we need a meal. But I know in youth ministry, we would buy the pizzas to get people to come, but they're already here. They're and so he says this to Philip, and Philip looks at the cost. I don't know if he's the accountant, one of the accountants but he's saying this is going to cost more than half a year's wages. And Andrew, who's listening in, says, well, here's this boy with 5 small loaves and 2 small fish, which was clearly not enough to feed everyone. But it's interesting to see what Jesus knows, that he sees what is there, and is able to do something with what's there. And I think it's really neat to see and to think about in my own life when it seems like there is not enough of whatever I need. I look at what I have, and sometimes more than I look at what I have, I look at what I don't have. And Jesus sees that and says, I can make that enough. Dave, you were talking earlier just about some of the themes of this bread of life, and just throughout scripture.
Yeah, it's this really interesting, like you read this story, we tend to read, okay, I'm going to read this story in the Bible or this one, but they're all a part of the same one big story. Like the Bible is a story, and we're just getting little glimpses here. We just read one sentence out of this whole, books, chapters long story. It's like, a 60, how many books are there in the Bible? 66, is that? Yeah, it's like a 66 book long series, more than the Sherlock Holmes stories or whatever. Like there's so many, and it just keeps going. And throughout that story, one of the themes that pops up again and again is what Jason was just talking about, is that like we as humans, as people, we worry about having enough. And the thing that we find again and again in Scripture, even before that worry creeps in, is that God does provide enough. That providing food for us to eat is nothing for God. Like it's important to him, he does it, but it doesn't tax his abilities. Like he's able to do it again and again. And so I look at it and I see kind of probably 5 points especially that sort of trace this thread through Scripture. The first is like right when God creates the world. When he created the first people, he made this garden and put them in it, and he just says, enjoy the fruit of the garden. Like they didn't have to even sow, they didn't have to harvest, they just picked the fruit off the vine. They picked, whatever food was available, they just received it and ate it with thanks. And that was the beginning of our life with God. And then again, after we've left the garden, things have gone south, things have not gone well lately maybe in the story, but then God is again doing a work, and he's making the people of Israel, he's brought them out of slavery, and they're out in the wilderness, and they're saying, God, we don't have enough to eat. And they're worried about, do we have enough? Just like what Jason was just saying, what you were mentioning there. And God provides bread, just like bread from heaven is how they describe it. And the word manna that they give to it, they name this bread manna, which means, what is this? like they so can't comprehend what God is doing that the name they give to the bread is like, huh? Yeah. Like we didn't expect that. And God provides bread there in the wilderness. And then we jump forward here, 5,000 plus people gathered around Jesus, and they're off in a wilderness. Like they're outside of the city, they're far away from it, they're so far away, there's not food available. And again, they're gathered around, and again, their stomachs are starting to be hungry, and Jesus provides food for all of them to eat. And there's leftovers. Like there's more leftovers than there was available to begin with. It's the craziest part of the story. God's provision is so big. And I was, as we were talking about that before, I was just imagining, like in our congregation out in Woodbury, if at the start of the service I'd be like, hey, so who all needs food today? And like started taking a food order, because I knew we'd be there so long, everyone would be hungry. I think about half the people would be like, yeah, we'll see you next Sunday. Like, but these people, they're into it, and they're sticking around for the long haul. And then, after this again, and Jesus at the end of his life has the Last Supper, and that thing that we call communion or the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, all these different names for it, where he sits at a table and provides the bread and the wine for his disciples, and he says, this is my body broken for you. And here when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, he's talking about that same thing, providing food for us. And then this theme comes up one more really big time, and that's in the kingdom of heaven at the end of the story of Scripture, that we'll all be in. The kingdom, it said, is like a wedding feast where everybody is invited to partake and to receive of this food just freely from the hand of God. And like a wedding, you don't pay your way into a wedding, you just get an invitation. And it's like each one of these points, God just provides more than we've even asked for. And there's leftovers, there's so much of it. Like it's so good. And right in the middle of this is the point where Jesus says all that, like that provision of bread, it's me.
Yeah.
I am the bread of life. It's so good.
Yeah, and those words he's saying, and he brings up Exodus that you were talking about in the wilderness, and says, everyone who ate of that bread, they kept getting hungry, but I satisfy, basically. You eat of me, and says, I am the living bread, the bread of life. He says bread of life one place, and living bread. I haven't looked in the Greek to see if that's the same thing, but later on you see he talks about the living Father, just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father. So the one who feeds on me will live because of me. And just this idea of I've found the source of life. And I don't know how many of you listening are yearning for something and you can't really put your finger on it. C.S. Lewis talks about if there is a hunger for something, then the thing exists. And so if we get hungry for food because food exists, and our desires have an object of those desires. And just talking about how many of us have this desire. I mean, we believe that you have a desire for God. We are all created with desire for God, but how many of us try to fill that with something else? And I do this. I mean, I know the answers, right? And yet I will look to other things for satisfaction, and sometimes they don't work at all, and sometimes they just don't work for very long. But he's saying, I'm the living bread, this source, the thing you've been hungering for. I'm here. And Dave, you were talking about how they got their focus off a little bit. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that it seems like, mentioning these different parts where the God providing comes up and God feeding comes up. It's like in each one, there's this theme of God providing, but also us like wanting and us being anxious. And then after the fact, after God has provided, we get focused on the wrong thing. And Jesus like calls the people on that here. He's fed more than 5,000 people in this whole thing. And then after, they like want to keep following him, and they're looking for him, and they're like, this is amazing. Like, we got free food and more than we could eat. Like, of course you want more of that. And they show up, and Jesus like calls him on it. It's like, I know you're all here because it's not because you saw a miracle. It's not because you want the teaching. It's because your bellies are full and you like the food. And obviously he thinks that's good too. Like, he made the food. He thinks the food is good, but he's like, there's so much more than that food. It's I am the bread of life, and come to me, and all that yearning is satisfied in me. And it's just this amazing thing that Jesus is like, I provide these things for you, but the provider's even better than what's provided. And it's come to me and you won't be hungry anymore. And it's not just because I'm going to give you another loaf of bread. It's because I satisfy. And it's in a way, there's no like both of us like preach sermons most weeks, and you come up with different illustrations and pictures, and I can't think of any illustration that describes that, because there's nothing else in the world that's like that. This is unique. It's Jesus satisfies that full longing and more, and that's all there is. There's nothing else.
Right. I wonder when you say that, I think some people listening may have been following Jesus for most of their lives and have an idea of what it means to be satisfied in him. And what do you think for people who may not have that background, and they're hearing what we're saying and hearing these stories, but like, what does it mean to be satisfied in Jesus? What does it mean to feast on him, for him to be the meal? What would you say to that? And I'm going to take notes for myself too.
Sure. The thing that makes me, that's a really good question. The thing that makes me think of right away is there's this famous Christian pastor and bishop and writer named Augustine, probably the most influential Christian theologian who didn't write part of the Bible. Like, he's and he had this phrase. He said, my heart is restless, God, until I rest in you. And that it's just that, it's like, I will be restless until I rest in you. I'll always be hungry until I feast on you. And that, like, the only way to describe that sense of fullness is to taste of that. I had I guess the other, like, got to visit Tanzania once, and got to be there for a little bit and stayed in a house with the family, and they have this food called Ugali, and it's like ground up cornmeal, and then it's added water, and it looks kind of like mashed potatoes, but it's made with like corn flour. And for me, it wasn't my favorite part of the food there. It's fine, it's just not a whole lot to it. in my taste buds.
Yeah.
But for them, it's such a staple thing. It's like bread, it's like you have it with every meal. And they said, you have two stomachs, or we have two stomachs. They said you have your Ugali stomach and your other food stomach, and you're not full unless they're both satisfied.
Wow.
And it's like you have to eat both of them to feel like you had a good meal.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of it too. It's like God gives us both of those. He gives us the actual just food that we eat day to day, but he gives us himself too. And if both of those aren't satisfied, then we're not satisfied.
That's really good. I love that. So I think I don't have anything after that actually. So I will say, you're talking about the in the wilderness, the people, there's something to that too, the what is it, the bread, the manna. I thought it was an interesting thing that God provides it, but they still have to go pick it up. And there's something in our relationship with God, and even being satisfied in God, that God provides, but we still have to meet him there. We still have to put in part of that as well. And God provides the bread to feed the 5,000, but even then there's a kid who's showing up with fish and loaves. And how those interactions, it's like, well, God does the miracle, the kid provides some of the bread, and God multiplies it. But I'm wondering how we're talking about being satisfied in God, but here in this, it's also God using us to satisfy the needs of other people. This kid brought lunch, and ended up not just being lunch for him, but for other people. And just thinking about how maybe in your lives, are there things that you have in your hands that may not seem enough for all the needs of the people around you, but who knows what God can do with those things?
Yeah. I think that's a good place to finish up. That's a really good question to move forward with. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for spending some time with us today. We'll be back next week, I think, talking about the light of the world, and the week after that, and the week after that. If you have any questions, post them in the comments, or you can email jason@homechurch.co, or message us on Facebook.
Get in touch respond on Facebook here on our church Facebook page, or
Perfect. But thanks for being with us, and we will see you next week.
Absolutely.